Long before Seoul society became known as a realm of order, balance, and carefully enforced laws, it was a place ruled almost entirely by violence. Modern fans of Bleach often picture the Seireitei as a disciplined military state where captains uphold justice, protect innocent souls, and preserve the balance between the worlds of the living and the dead. They imagine an ancient institution built upon honor, tradition, and responsibility. Yet that image only represents the Seoul society that existed after centuries of stability. If we travel back roughly 1,000 years, we discover a very different world, one where survival mattered more than justice, and where the organization that would eventually become the Gotei 13 inspired fear rather than admiration. The original Gotei 13 was not created to embody peace. It was created to win. That distinction explains almost everything about its earliest history. When modern captains such as Shunsui Kyoraku, Jushiro Ukitake, Toshiro Hitsugaya, or Byakuya Kuchiki speak about duty, they are representing an institution that has already evolved through centuries of reflection and reform. The first generation of captains belonged to an entirely different age. They lived during a period when Seoul society faced existential threats from every direction, when centralized authority barely existed, and when the only leaders capable of surviving were those willing to embrace overwhelming violence. Even Genryūsai Yamamoto, the founder of the Gotei 13, and one of the most respected figures in Bleach history, would later admit that the original organization was composed of killers. That admission is extraordinarily revealing. Yamamoto was not a man given to exaggeration or self-criticism. Throughout most of Bleach, he carried himself with unwavering confidence, believing deeply in the institutions he had spent centuries building. Yet when reflecting upon the first generation of captains, he acknowledged a truth that many within Seoul society preferred not to discuss. The original Gotei 13 did not inspire loyalty because of moral authority. They inspired obedience because they were the most dangerous individuals alive. To understand why such an organization emerged, we must first understand the world that existed before it. Seoul society, 1,000 years ago, was dramatically different from the orderly civilization seen during Ichigo Kurosaki's lifetime. The Seireitei had not yet become the powerful political and military center familiar to modern audiences. While the 5 great noble houses already held considerable influence, much of Seoul society remained fragmented. Vast regions beyond the Seireitei existed with little meaningful oversight, and the districts that would later become known collectively as the Rukongai varied enormously in terms of safety, prosperity, and governance. For countless ordinary souls, daily life was uncertain. Food was scarce in many districts. Violence was common. Local disputes often escalated without anyone capable of enforcing lasting peace. The further one traveled from the center of the Seireitei, the weaker centralized authority became, creating an environment where strength frequently determined survival far more effectively than written laws. This instability extended beyond internal affairs. The balance between the worlds of the living and the dead faced constant pressure from powerful hollows roaming unchecked, while hostile spiritual forces emerged whenever existing power structures weakened. Soul Society did not simply need administrators or judges. It needed warriors capable of confronting enemies that threatened the very foundation of existence. Yet there was another danger growing in the shadows. The Quincy. Modern audiences often associate the Quincy with Juhvach and the Wandenreich, but their conflict with Soul Society stretches back far further than the 1,000-year blood war. Long before Ichigo Kurosaki was born, the Quincy had already become one of the greatest challenges Soul Society had ever faced. Unlike Shinigami, whose duty centered upon maintaining the natural balance of souls, Quincy destroyed hollows completely. Every hollow erased from existence without purification disrupted the delicate equilibrium separating life, death, and rebirth. At first glance, this difference might appear philosophical rather than practical. In reality, it threatened the stability of the entire cosmological system. Shinigami purified hollows, allowing their souls to return to the cycle of reincarnation. Quincy annihilated those same souls entirely. If practiced on a large enough scale, Quincy techniques possessed the potential to destabilize reality itself. Whether every Quincy fully understood these consequences remains uncertain. But Soul Society certainly believed the danger was real. Tensions escalated. Distrust deepened. Conflict became increasingly unavoidable. At the center of this growing crisis stood Yamamoto. Much about Yamamoto's early life remains intentionally mysterious within Bleach canon. But what little information we possess paints a fascinating picture. By the time the original Gotei 13 was established, Yamamoto was already regarded as perhaps the greatest Shinigami of his age. His mastery of Zanjutsu, Hakuda, Kido, and spiritual pressure placed him in a category few could even approach. Most terrifying of all was his Zanpakuto, Ryujin Jaka, whose flames possessed destructive capabilities unlike anything previously witnessed within Soul Society. Power alone, however, does not explain why people followed him. Many powerful individuals existed during that era. What made Yamamoto unique was his ability to unite them. That achievement may have been even more extraordinary than his legendary combat abilities. Imagine attempting to organize 13 of the strongest and most violent warriors in existence, each possessing immense pride, overwhelming spiritual pressure, and little reason to obey anyone else. Such individuals rarely cooperate voluntarily. They dominate. They compete. They eliminate rivals. Yet somehow, Yamamoto convinced them to fight beneath a single banner. The organization he created would become known as the Gotei 13. Its name translates roughly to the 13 court guard companies, but that peaceful-sounding title can be misleading when applied to its earliest incarnation. The first Gotei functioned less like a disciplined military institution and more like an alliance of predators directed toward common enemies. Every captain possessed extraordinary strength. Every captain commanded unquestioned authority. Every captain had earned a reputation capable of inspiring terror. Centuries later, Shunsui Kyoraku would describe them in remarkably blunt terms. They were killers, not reluctant soldiers forced into difficult decisions, not guardians burdened by moral responsibility. Killers. That single word reshapes everything we think we know about early Soul Society. It suggests that the organization responsible for protecting the balance between worlds was originally built not upon ideals of justice, but upon the simple recognition that only overwhelming violence could survive an age consumed by constant warfare. The values associated with later generations had not yet developed. Honor came later. Procedure came later. Restraint came later. The beginning was something much harsher. The beginning belonged to monsters. Among those monsters stood figures whose names would eventually become legendary throughout Soul Society. One captain had once been the greatest criminal of her generation before becoming the first Kenpachi. Another possessed such overwhelming spiritual pressure that even fellow captains treated him with caution. Others remain almost entirely anonymous, their faces preserved only in brief glimpses thousands of years after their deaths. Yet even those fleeting appearances reveal expressions devoid of hesitation or mercy. They did not resemble protectors. They resembled conquerors. And perhaps that was exactly what Soul Society required, because the threats gathering beyond its borders were unlike anything later generations would ever face. The Quincy Empire under Yihwach was continuing to grow stronger. Hollows remained an ever-present danger. Internal disorder threatened to fracture Soul Society before it could fully establish itself as a unified power. Against enemies of that magnitude, compassion alone would accomplish nothing. Yamamoto understood this better than anyone. If Soul Society was going to survive, it first needed to become feared. Only afterward could it become respected. That philosophy would define the earliest years of the Gotei 13, shaping an era remembered not for diplomacy or justice, but for overwhelming conquest. Before the captains became symbols of order, before the Seirete became a center of civilization, and before the Soul Society developed into the institution modern audiences recognize, the original Gotei 13 would wage campaigns so ruthless that even 1,000 years later, their reputation remained powerful enough to unsettle those who inherited their legacy. The greatest misconception surrounding the original Gotei 13 is the belief that they were simply earlier versions of the captains who exist during the main events of Bleach. It is easy to assume that the institution has always operated according to the same principles, merely changing uniforms, leadership, and traditions over the centuries. The reality is considerably darker. The first captains were not selected because they embodied justice, wisdom, or compassion. They were chosen because they possessed something far more valuable during an age of constant warfare. They were individuals capable of overwhelming almost anyone who stood before them. Strength was the only qualification that truly mattered. Everything else came second. Modern Soul Society often speaks about balance, discipline, and protecting the cycle of souls. But those ideals only became possible after centuries of relative stability. During Yamamoto's era, survival remained the highest priority. A peaceful government cannot exist unless someone first ensures that it survives long enough to govern. And that responsibility fell upon the shoulders of 13 extraordinary individuals whose reputations were built not through diplomacy, but through violence. When Shunsui Kyoraku reflected upon the first generation during the 1,000-year blood war, his description was remarkably blunt. He explained that the original Gotei 13 were a collection of ruthless killers, unlike the captains serving in the modern era. Coming from Shunsui, one of the most thoughtful and compassionate leaders in Seoul society's history, those words carry tremendous weight. He admired Yamamoto deeply, yet even he recognized that the organization's earliest members belonged to an entirely different world. They did not hesitate. They did not negotiate unless necessary. And they certainly did not allow morality to interfere with victory. That does not necessarily mean every captain was cruel by nature. Human beings are products of the eras in which they live, and the Seoul society of 1,000 years ago demanded qualities that later generations would find deeply uncomfortable. A warrior who hesitated might doom an entire division. A commander who valued mercy over decisive action could place the balance of the worlds at risk. Within that environment, ruthlessness became not merely acceptable, but essential. Even so, the original captains appear unusually intimidating. When Tite Kubo finally revealed their designs during the 1,000-year Blood War arc, fans immediately noticed how different they looked from later generations. There were no friendly smiles, no approachable expressions, no sense of quiet dignity like that associated with captains such as Jushiro Ukitake or Retsu Unohana during most of the series. Instead, the first generation projected an unmistakable aura of menace. Many appeared scarred. Others wore expressions suggesting absolute confidence in their ability to kill anyone standing before them. Several looked less like military officers and more like warlords who had conquered entire regions through sheer force. This artistic decision was almost certainly intentional. Appearance communicates philosophy. The original Gotei was never meant to resemble a modern military organization governed by regulations and traditions. It resembled a gathering of apex predators who had agreed, at least temporarily, to hunt in the same direction. Every captain radiated overwhelming individuality, suggesting that Yamamoto had not recruited obedient followers, but rather subdued or persuaded the strongest figures of an extraordinarily violent age. That achievement alone deserves greater appreciation. Leading powerful people is difficult. Leading 13 individuals who may each believe themselves invincible is something else entirely. Yamamoto somehow accomplished it. The clearest example of the type of people serving within the first Gotei is found in one captain, whose true history remained hidden for hundreds of years. Retsu Unohana. For most of Bleach, Unohana appears gentle, compassionate, and endlessly patient. She serves as the captain of the 4th Division, dedicating herself to healing the wounded and preserving life whenever possible. Younger Shinigami view her as one of the kindest individuals in Seoul society, while even veteran captains treat her with enormous respect. Few characters seem further removed from the brutal image associated with the original Gotei. That illusion survives until the 1,000-year Blood War. During her confrontation with Kenpachi Zaraki, the truth finally emerges. long before becoming the greatest healer in Soul Society, Unohana was known by another name, Yachiru Unohana. She was the first Kenpachi. The title of Kenpachi is not inherited through noble bloodlines or political appointment. It belongs to the strongest warrior who defeats the previous holder. To become the very first Kenpachi meant there was no tradition to inherit. Unohana created the title herself through unmatched skill in battle. She earned it because everyone else acknowledged that she stood at the very peak of lethal combat. Even more revealing is the reputation she possessed. Unohana was described as the most notorious criminal in Soul Society's history before joining Yamamoto. Not one of the most dangerous, the most dangerous. That single fact fundamentally changes how we understand the founding of the Gotei 13. Yamamoto did not simply recruit decorated soldiers and talented officers. He recruited individuals so terrifying that one of them had already become legendary as the greatest criminal ever known. Rather than executing her, he made her a captain. The implications are extraordinary. It suggests that Yamamoto viewed raw ability as more valuable than reputation. If someone possessed enough strength to protect Soul Society, their past could become secondary. During peaceful eras, such pragmatism would appear deeply unethical. During an age where entire civilizations faced annihilation, the calculation became considerably more complicated. Unohana was almost certainly not unique. Although Bleach has revealed very little about the remaining founding captains, their appearances, and Yamamoto's own philosophy strongly imply similar backgrounds. Some may have been warlords controlling entire regions. Others may have been feared duelists whose names alone discouraged resistance. Still others may have emerged from violent districts within the Rukongai, where only the strongest survived into adulthood. Whatever their individual histories, they all shared one characteristic. They had already proven themselves through bloodshed before joining the Gotei. This also explains why the first captains appear so different from later generations. Modern captains usually rise through centuries of structured training within the Shin-O Academy, gradually earning promotions through demonstrated leadership, discipline, and service. The original captains belonged to a period before such systems fully existed. Their qualifications were established on battlefields rather than classrooms, through survival rather than examination, and through personal reputation rather than institutional approval. In many respects, they resembled independent generals who had been united beneath a single command, rather than officers promoted within an existing military hierarchy. That distinction shaped the culture of the early Gotei. Respect was earned through strength. Authority rested upon demonstrated power. Weakness invited replacement. It was an environment where every captain understood that their position depended not upon political influence, but upon their ability to stand victorious against extraordinary opponents. Such a culture naturally produced warriors of exceptional quality, yet it also ensured that violence remained deeply embedded within the organization's identity. This culture would eventually prove devastating for Soul Society's enemies. When 13 individuals of that caliber fought together under Yamamoto's command, they became something the spiritual world had never witnessed before. They were no longer isolated legends pursuing personal ambitions. They became a unified military force capable of directing unimaginable destructive power toward a common objective. That objective would soon reveal itself. Far beyond the walls of the Seirei, another ruler was assembling an army every bit as ambitious as Yamamoto's. Unlike the scattered Quincy clans that existed in later centuries, this force possessed centralized leadership, remarkable discipline, and absolute loyalty to a single individual whose ambitions extended far beyond simple survival. His name was Ichigo, and the collision between Yamamoto's ruthless captains and the growing Quincy Empire would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in the entire history of Bleach, establishing a legacy so brutal that even 1,000 years later, the survivors still struggled to speak about it, without remembering the terrifying men and women who transformed the Gotei 13 into the most feared military force Soul Society had ever known. Long before the 1,000-year blood war engulfed Soul Society, the Quincy had already established themselves as one of the greatest powers in the spiritual world. Modern audiences are introduced to them as an ancient race of spiritually aware humans capable of destroying hollows. But that description barely captures the scale of what they had become 1,000 years before Ichigo Kurosaki's story began. Under the leadership of Ichigo, the Quincy were no longer scattered families defending isolated communities. They had evolved into a disciplined empire with a unified purpose, immense military strength, and a leader whose ambitions reached far beyond the human world. To Soul Society, they represented an existential threat, not simply because they were powerful, because they challenged the very system the Shinigami existed to protect. The conflict between the Shinigami and the Quincy is often misunderstood as little more than a war between rival factions, yet the disagreement was fundamentally ideological before it became military. The Shinigami preserved the cycle of souls by purifying hollows and allowing them to re-enter the natural process of reincarnation. The Quincy approached the problem differently. Their techniques erased hollows completely, removing those souls from existence rather than cleansing them. While this method appeared more efficient, it carried catastrophic long-term consequences. If enough souls disappeared permanently, the balance separating the worlds would eventually collapse. Whether every Quincy accepted Soul Society's explanation remains uncertain. Whether every Shinigami fully understood the consequences is equally uncertain. What is beyond dispute is that neither side believed compromise remained possible. As tensions continued rising, both civilizations prepared for conflict. For Ichigo, war was not something to avoid. It was something to embrace. Unlike most rulers, Ichigo possessed extraordinary confidence, rooted in abilities unlike those of any ordinary Quincy. His power allowed him not only to command overwhelming loyalty, but also to shape the future of his people according to his own vision. Those serving beneath him viewed him as far more than a military commander. He was a father, a king, and almost a divine figure whose authority seemed absolute. This unwavering devotion transformed the Quincy into an extraordinarily dangerous force. Armies held together by fear often collapse under pressure. Armies united by faith rarely do. The Wandenreich expanded steadily, gathering powerful warriors whose abilities rivaled some of Seoul society's greatest captains. Their organization emphasized discipline, coordination, and absolute loyalty, creating a military unlike anything the Shinigami had previously encountered. Every victory strengthened their confidence. Every new recruit increased their influence. Every passing year brought the two civilizations closer to a confrontation that neither side appeared willing to prevent. Yamamoto watched these developments carefully. Unlike later generations, who inherited an already established Gotei 13, Yamamoto understood that his organization had not yet proven itself. The captains under his command were individually terrifying, but they had never faced an enemy capable of matching them on such a massive scale. If the Quincy succeeded, Seoul society itself could cease to exist in its current form. There would be no second chance, no opportunity to rebuild after defeat. The coming war would determine which civilization survived. This realization shaped Yamamoto's approach from the very beginning. He did not prepare for a limited campaign. He prepared for total victory. The original Gotei 13 reflected that objective perfectly. These were not officers expected to negotiate treaties after the fighting ended. They were warriors, assembled to crush an enemy before that enemy could threaten Seoul society again. Modern readers sometimes judge their brutality through the moral standards of later generations, but doing so overlooks the desperate circumstances surrounding their creation. Yamamoto believed the survival of the entire spiritual world depended upon the outcome of this conflict, and his captains shared that belief. The Quincy believed exactly the same thing. When both sides become convinced that defeat means extinction, wars inevitably become more brutal than anyone initially expects. That is precisely what happened. The war that followed would become one of the defining moments in Seoul society's history, not simply because of who won, but because of how that victory was achieved. The original Gotei 13 entered the battlefield with a reputation for violence, and by the time the conflict ended, that reputation had become legend. Even 1,000 years later, survivors of the Quincy remembered those captains not as honorable warriors, but as relentless executioners whose methods permanently shaped the way both civilizations viewed one another. The age of restraint had not yet arrived. The age of conquest was about to begin. When the war between Seoul society and the Quincy finally began, it quickly became clear that neither side had misunderstood the other. This would not be a limited border conflict or a series of carefully negotiated military engagements. It would become a struggle for survival between two civilizations that believed their own existence depended upon victory. Every battle carried enormous consequences. Every commander understood what defeat might mean, and every soldier marched into combat knowing there was little room for mercy. The original Gotei 13 entered this conflict unlike any military force Seoul society had ever assembled. Although the organization was still relatively young, its captains possessed an extraordinary concentration of power. Yamamoto had intentionally gathered individuals whose names already inspired fear across the spiritual world. They were not chosen because they worked well together or because they shared the same ideals. They were chosen because each one represented overwhelming force capable of changing the outcome of a battlefield through personal strength alone. Under ordinary circumstances, assembling so many dangerous personalities into a single organization might have led to internal conflict. During wartime, however, Yamamoto gave them a common purpose, powerful enough to unite them: destroy the enemy before the enemy destroyed Soul Society. That philosophy shaped every campaign that followed. The Quincy were equally prepared. Under Ivach's leadership, they had developed into a disciplined military whose soldiers possessed remarkable mastery over spiritual weapons and reishi manipulation. Their fighting style differed fundamentally from that of the Shinigami. Rather than relying primarily upon zanpakuto, they shaped spiritual particles directly into bows, arrows, and countless other techniques that allowed them to fight with tremendous precision and destructive force. Their discipline, organization, and unwavering loyalty made them one of the most formidable opponents Soul Society had ever encountered. What followed was not a war of gradual advances and cautious maneuvering. It became a series of devastating offensives. Canon reveals surprisingly few specific battles from this ancient conflict, but the fragments we do possess paint a remarkably consistent picture. Wherever the original captains fought, they overwhelmed their opponents with ruthless efficiency. They did not hesitate after gaining an advantage. They did not offer opportunities for retreat. Their objective was complete victory, and every decision reflected that goal. This is precisely why Shunsui Kyoraku later described them as killers. The word was not intended as an insult. It was a historical observation. These captains belonged to an era where compassion toward an enemy capable of destroying your civilization could easily become a fatal mistake. They fought with an intensity that later generations would find deeply unsettling because they genuinely believed they were defending the balance of the worlds from irreversible collapse. At the center of every major engagement stood Yamamoto himself. Even 1,000 years later, few individuals in Bleach approached his level of raw power. During the First Quincy War, he was in his absolute prime, wielding Ryujin Jaka with devastating precision. The flames of his Zanpakuto were already feared throughout the spiritual world, capable of reducing entire battlefields to ash, while overwhelming opponents who considered themselves invincible. Wherever Yamamoto appeared, the momentum of the battle shifted. For Quincy soldiers, facing the captain commander meant confronting a force of nature rather than an ordinary warrior. Yet Yamamoto was not fighting alone. The remaining captains carved their own paths across the battlefield, demonstrating exactly why they had earned positions within the original Gotei 13. Among them was Yachiru Unohana, the first Kenpachi, whose reputation for violence had already become legendary before she ever joined Yamamoto's ranks. Although later generations would know her as the gentle captain of the 4th Division, the woman fighting during this war embodied an entirely different identity. She sought out the strongest opponents, defeated them without hesitation, and established herself as one of the deadliest warriors Seoul society had ever produced. The surviving images of the original captains reinforce this impression. Their expressions are calm. Their posture is confident. None of them appear burdened by doubt. They look like individuals who had accepted violence as an unavoidable part of their existence long before the war began. That confidence proved decisive. As the conflict continued, the Quincy gradually discovered that they were not facing opponents interested merely in defending territory. They were confronting an organization determined to eliminate the threat completely. Every victory strengthened the Gotei's reputation, while every defeat weakened the Quincy Empire's ability to sustain a prolonged campaign. Momentum slowly shifted towards Seoul society, and with each passing battle, the legend of Yamamoto and his captains continued growing. By the time the war approached its final stages, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The original Gotei 13 had succeeded in becoming exactly what Yamamoto intended. They were no longer simply the strongest military force within Seoul society. They had become the most feared military force in the entire spiritual world. That reputation would ultimately help secure victory. It would also ensure that the methods used during this war remained controversial for the next 1,000 years, because defeating the Quincy required decisions so ruthless that even many later Shinigami preferred not to remember how the first generation had truly won. By the final stages of the war, the balance of power had shifted decisively in Seoul society's favor. The Quincy had entered the conflict as a disciplined and confident empire under the leadership of Iwatch, believing they possessed both the strength and the conviction necessary to defeat the Shinigami. They fought with extraordinary determination, supported by powerful techniques that had already proven capable of challenging some of Seoul society's greatest warriors. Yet despite their courage and organization, they found themselves facing an enemy unlike anything they had anticipated. The original Gotei 13 did not simply seek victory. They sought finality. This distinction is crucial to understanding why the conflict is remembered by many fans as the first Quincy genocide rather than merely another war. The goal of Yamamoto's army was not to weaken the Quincy enough to negotiate peace. It was to eliminate their ability to threaten Seoul society ever again. Every successful campaign pushed the Quincy closer to complete military collapse, and as their losses mounted, it became increasingly clear that there would be no negotiated settlement waiting at the end of the conflict. Canon deliberately leaves many details of this period unexplained, but several facts are firmly established. Iwatch himself was ultimately defeated by Yamamoto 1,000 years before the events of the main story, forcing him into a long period of recovery while his empire collapsed around him. Without their king leading them, the Quincy lost both their greatest warrior and the symbol that united their civilization. For most nations, such a defeat would have marked the end of the war. For the original Gotei 13, it marked the beginning of something even harsher. Rather than allowing the surviving Quincy to rebuild, Seoul society continued dismantling the remnants of their empire. Military strongholds were destroyed. Organized resistance was crushed wherever it appeared. The Quincy ceased functioning as a unified civilization, and instead became scattered groups struggling merely to survive. By the time the campaign finally ended, the empire that had once threatened Soul Society had effectively disappeared from history. From Yamamoto's perspective, this outcome represented necessity rather than cruelty. He believed the Quincy posed an existential danger. As long as they remained organized beneath Yuvach's leadership, another war was inevitable. If enough hollows continued being erased rather than purified, the balance of souls itself might eventually collapse. Allowing the Quincy to recover was therefore a risk he refused to accept. Whether that judgment was morally justified remains one of the most fascinating debates in all of Bleach. There are compelling arguments on both sides. Soul Society genuinely carried the responsibility of maintaining the balance between worlds, and the Quincy method of destroying hollows represented a legitimate threat to that balance. At the same time, not every Quincy shared responsibility for the war. Many were simply members of a civilization following the leader they had always known. The distinction between defeating an army and nearly eradicating an entire people becomes impossible to ignore. This moral ambiguity is one of Tite Kubo's greatest strengths as a writer. Rarely does Bleach present history as a simple conflict between heroes and villains. Instead, every major historical event leaves behind questions that remain difficult to answer centuries later. The First Quincy War is perhaps the clearest example of that approach. For Soul Society, the campaign became remembered as a decisive victory that preserved the stability of existence itself. For the Quincy, it became remembered as a catastrophe that nearly erased their entire race. Both perspectives contain truth. The brutality of the original Gotei 13 also explains why later generations viewed them with such awe. Their reputation did not emerge solely because they defeated powerful enemies. It emerged because they accomplished what many believed impossible. They brought down the greatest Quincy empire in history and shattered an army led by Yuvach himself, a figure whose power would later terrify even the modern Gotei 13. When Shunsui later remarked that the original captains were stronger because they were ruthless, he was not glorifying violence. He was acknowledging historical reality. Those men and women fought without hesitation during an era where hesitation could have meant annihilation. That willingness to do whatever was necessary became their defining characteristic. At the center of it all stood Yamamoto. His duel with Yuvach became legendary, not only because he emerged victorious, but because it established him as the uncontested protector of Soul Society for the next 1,000 years. The respect he commanded throughout the series was built upon this victory. Every captain who later served beneath him inherited an institution whose authority had been forged during that ancient war. Yet victory came at a cost. The first Gotei 13 had succeeded in preserving Soul Society, but they had also created a legacy stained by extraordinary bloodshed. The survivors who remained carried memories of campaigns so ruthless that later generations quietly allowed many details to fade into history. Over time, the organization itself gradually changed. New captains entered its ranks. Different philosophies emerged. The ideals of duty, restraint, and justice slowly replaced the brutal pragmatism that defined its earliest years. But history has a habit of refusing to stay buried. Unknown to almost everyone within Soul Society, Yavache had not truly died. Defeated and weakened beyond imagination, he entered a 1,000-year cycle of recovery, exactly as foretold in the ancient Quincy prophecy. While the Gotei believed the war had ended forever, the man they thought they had destroyed was patiently waiting in the shadows, gathering strength one fragment at a time. The original captains believed they had ended the Quincy threat. In reality, they had only delayed it. And when that ancient enemy finally returned 1,000 years later, the modern Gotei 13 would discover that defeating Yavache had been far easier than living with the consequences of the decisions their predecessors made during the bloodiest war in Soul Society's history. The destruction of the Quincy Empire marked the greatest military victory in the history of the original Gotei 13, but it also marked the beginning of the organization's transformation. Wars have a way of changing not only the nations that fight them, but also the people who survive them. The captains who marched into battle under Yamamoto 1,000 years earlier were already among the most dangerous individuals in Soul Society. Yet the experiences of that conflict reshaped both the institution they served and the philosophy that would guide it for centuries to come. The Gotei 13 had proven that fear could secure victory. The far more difficult question was whether fear could build a lasting peace. For a time, the answer appeared to be yes. With Yavache defeated and the Quincy Empire shattered, no rival military force remained capable of challenging Soul Society directly. The greatest external threat had disappeared, and the Seirete entered a period of relative stability unlike anything it had experienced before. The captains, who had once spent their lives preparing for constant warfare, now found themselves governing an increasingly organized society whose greatest needs were no longer conquest, but administration, law, and order. The institution gradually adapted to this new reality. The early Gotei had functioned almost like an alliance of warlords united beneath Yamamoto's command. Every captain commanded respect through overwhelming personal strength, and the culture of the organization reflected the brutal era in which it had been founded. As generations passed, however, that culture slowly began changing. Systems became more formalized. Military divisions developed clearer responsibilities. Training became more structured. Future captains increasingly earned their positions through experience, discipline, and leadership, rather than simply establishing themselves as the strongest warriors alive. This transformation did not happen quickly. It unfolded across centuries. Many members of the original generation remained alive long enough to witness these changes firsthand, including Yamamoto himself and Yachiru Unohana. Their continued presence ensured that the memories of the old era never disappeared entirely, even as the organization surrounding them became almost unrecognizable. Perhaps no individual symbolizes this evolution more clearly than Unohana. When audiences first meet her, she appears to embody compassion. She leads the 4th Division with remarkable patience, devoting herself almost entirely to healing the wounded rather than defeating enemies. Younger Shinigami know her only as a calm, reassuring presence whose gentle demeanor seems impossible to disturb. Few realize they are standing beside the very woman who once terrified the entire Soul Society as the first Kenpachi. Her transformation mirrors the transformation of the Gotei itself. The greatest killer of one age became the greatest healer of the next. That change was not accidental. It reflected an organization slowly redefining what strength truly meant. The same pattern can be observed throughout Soul Society's institutions. As the immediate threat of extinction faded into history, qualities such as wisdom, restraint, and responsibility became increasingly valuable. Captains were expected not only to win battles, but also to preserve stability, mentor younger officers, and protect the balance between the worlds without resorting to unnecessary violence. The ideals that modern fans associate with the Gotei 13 were born during this long period of peace, rather than during its violent founding. Even Yamamoto changed. Although he never abandoned his uncompromising sense of duty, the captain-commander, seen throughout most of Bleach, is noticeably different from the man who led the original Gotei. Age brought patience. Experience brought perspective. The warrior who once assembled 13 ruthless killers gradually became the elderly leader who insisted upon discipline, tradition, and adherence to the law. He remained capable of extraordinary violence when necessary, but he no longer celebrated it as the defining characteristic of his organization. This evolution is one of the most fascinating aspects of his character. Yamamoto did not reject the past. He built something better because of it. He understood exactly how terrible the original Gotei had been because he had created it. He also understood that if Soul Society wished to endure for another 1,000 years, it could not remain an institution governed solely by fear. Fear had won the war, but peace required something more enduring. Not everyone shared that lesson. The Central 46 remained deeply conservative, often prioritizing stability over justice. The noble houses continued protecting their privileges. Many of the political structures established after the First Quincy War still reflected the same rigid hierarchy that had existed during Yamamoto's youth. Although the Gotei itself became more honorable, Soul Society never entirely escaped the harsh worldview that had shaped its earliest history. Those unresolved contradictions quietly accumulated over the centuries. To ordinary Shinigami, the ancient war gradually became little more than history. New generations grew up hearing stories about Yamamoto's victory over Ichigo without fully understanding the price paid to achieve it. The brutality of the original captains faded into legend, and many details were either forgotten or deliberately left unspoken. The institution preferred celebrating its triumph rather than examining the moral complexity surrounding it. The Quincy, however, remembered everything. For the scattered survivors, the destruction of their empire was not an ancient historical event. It was an inherited memory. Stories of villages destroyed, families erased, and an entire civilization brought to the edge of extinction continued passing from one generation to the next. While Soul Society viewed the war as a necessary act of preservation, the Quincy remembered it as proof that the Shinigami would always choose extermination over coexistence whenever they felt threatened. Those memories, never disappeared. Neither did Ifach. Hidden in the shadows, patiently recovering according to the ancient prophecy, he waited while Soul Society slowly convinced itself that the greatest war in its history had ended forever. Centuries passed. Captains came and went. Entire generations lived and died, believing the Quincy existed only as scattered remnants, with no hope of ever challenging the Seireitoi again. It was a comforting illusion, and like many comforting illusions, it would eventually shatter. Because while the Gotei 13 spent the next 1,000 years becoming protectors, administrators, and guardians of peace, the enemy they believed they had destroyed spent those same centuries preparing for revenge. When that revenge finally arrived, the modern captains would discover that they were not merely fighting a new war. They were confronting the unfinished consequences of decisions made by the original Gotei 13, whose victories had preserved Soul Society, but whose methods had also planted the seeds for an even greater conflict still waiting to unfold. History is often written by those who survive, but memory belongs to everyone. After the fall of the original Quincy Empire, Soul Society, and the surviving Quincy remembered the same war in completely different ways. To the Shinigami, the conflict had been a necessary act of self-preservation that protected the balance of the worlds from collapse. To the Quincy, it had been the destruction of an entire civilization, carried out by an organization whose overwhelming military power left almost nothing standing in its path. Both sides believed their version of history was justified. And over the course of the next 1,000 years, those opposing memories slowly evolved into something even more dangerous. They became inherited hatred. One of the most remarkable aspects of Bleach is that conflicts rarely end when the fighting stops. Instead, wars continue echoing across generations, influencing people who were not even alive when the original battles took place. The 1,000-year Blood War is perhaps the greatest example of this idea. The soldiers fighting beneath Yuvach during the final arc were not simply seeking conquest. Many believed they were completing a struggle that had begun a millennium earlier, avenging ancestors who had been hunted to the brink of extinction by the original Gotei 13. From their perspective, justice had simply taken a very long time to arrive. Meanwhile, Soul Society experienced an entirely different century of history. The Seireitei expanded. Its military institutions became more refined. The divisions developed distinct responsibilities beyond combat, allowing the Gotei 13 to function not only as an army, but also as the primary governing force responsible for maintaining order throughout Soul Society. The Shin-O Academy trained new generations of officers. Traditions became firmly established, and many of the brutal practices associated with the earliest captains gradually disappeared. As time passed, fewer people personally remembered the First Quincy War. Stories replaced first-hand experience. Legends replaced living memory. The terrifying captains who once conquered battlefields slowly became respected historical figures, rather than frightening reminders of an exceptionally violent age. Yamamoto alone remained as a direct connection to that past. His extraordinary lifespan allowed him to witness nearly the entire transformation of Soul Society. He remembered what the Seireitei had looked like before stability existed. He remembered assembling the original captains. He remembered defeating Iwak with his own hands. Every major institution that younger Shinigami considered ancient had, from Yamamoto's perspective, emerged gradually over centuries of careful effort. That perspective shaped his leadership. Many fans have wondered why Yamamoto often appeared so uncompromising throughout the series. His strict adherence to tradition could sometimes seem excessive, especially when viewed alongside more flexible captains such as Shunsui Kyoraku or Jushiro Ukitake. Yet, considering everything he had experienced, his behavior becomes much easier to understand. Yamamoto had seen civilizations rise and collapse. He had witnessed wars capable of threatening the balance of existence itself. Rules were not abstract principles to him. They were safeguards built upon centuries of painful experience. The problem was that his enemies had spent those same centuries learning different lessons. Hidden within the Shoten Bereich, the invisible empire concealed inside the shadows of Soul Society itself, Iwak slowly rebuilt what had once been destroyed. The surviving Quincy never accepted defeat as permanent. Instead, they patiently prepared for the day their king would recover his full strength. Entire generations dedicated their lives to that goal, passing down stories of the ancient war until vengeance became woven into the very identity of the Wandenreich. Time, rather than healing old wounds, allowed them to deepen. This difference in perspective would eventually become one of Soul Society's greatest weaknesses. The Shinigami believed the ancient conflict belonged to history. The Quincy believed it belonged to the future. Neither side forgot. They simply remembered differently. 1,000 years is an unimaginably long period of time for most civilizations. Yet Bleach repeatedly reminds us that spiritual beings experience history differently. Captains can serve for centuries. Noble families preserve records stretching back millennia. Ancient grudges remain alive because the individuals who experienced them are often still alive as well. The passage of time changes societies, but it does not necessarily erase trauma. Yamamoto understood this. Unfortunately, understanding a danger does not always prevent it. Although he remained vigilant, even the captain commander gradually came to believe that the Quincy no longer possessed the strength necessary to threaten Soul Society directly. Small groups of Quincy still existed within the human world, but they appeared fragmented and politically insignificant compared to the empire that had once challenged the Gotei 13. The overwhelming victory achieved 1,000 years earlier seemed complete. It was precisely the conclusion Iwak wanted Soul Society to reach. Every year that passed allowed the Wandenreich to grow stronger without attracting suspicion. New Sternritter joined their ranks. Their military organization expanded. Their techniques evolved. Most importantly, they studied the modern Gotei 13 with extraordinary patience, learning how the institution had changed since the days of the original captains. What they discovered encouraged them. The Gotei remained powerful. It remained disciplined, but it no longer possessed the same ruthless character that had once made it nearly unstoppable. The terrifying killers who followed Yamamoto into the first Quincy War had gradually been replaced by protectors, teachers, healers, scholars, and noble leaders devoted to preserving peace rather than conquering enemies. From a moral perspective, this transformation represented remarkable progress. From a military perspective, however, Yhwach saw an opportunity. He believed the modern Gotei had grown zod. Whether that judgment was entirely accurate remains open to debate, but it became one of the central assumptions guiding his plans. Yhwach remembered the original Gotei better than anyone except Yamamoto himself. He had witnessed their brutality firsthand. He had watched them destroy his empire. Comparing those warriors to the captains leading Soul Society 1,000 years later, he concluded that the spirit which had once made the organization so terrifying had gradually disappeared. That belief gave him confidence. It also guaranteed that the next war would become far more than a simple military campaign. It would become a test of whether an institution founded through unimaginable violence could survive after transforming itself into something far more civilized. The answer would determine not only the future of Soul Society, but also whether the legacy of the original Gotei 13 had truly disappeared, or whether, when pushed to the edge of extinction once again, the descendants of those legendary captains would discover that the monsters who built their world had never entirely vanished. When the 1,000-year blood war finally began, the modern Gotei 13 believed it was confronting a new enemy. In reality, it was confronting the ghosts of its own past. Every battlefield, every casualty, and every decision made during the invasion reflected choices that had been made 1,000 years earlier. The conflict was not simply a war between the Shinigami and the Quincy. It was history returning to demand an answer for questions that had never truly been resolved. Yhwach understood this from the very beginning. His campaign was never based solely upon military conquest. He wanted Soul Society to experience the same fear, helplessness, and devastation that the Quincy Empire had experienced a millennium earlier. Victory alone was not enough. He wanted history reversed. He wanted the descendants of those who had destroyed his people to understand exactly what it felt like to watch an entire civilization collapse before an unstoppable enemy. That objective explains why the invasion unfolded with such ruthless precision. The Sternritter did not attack randomly. They targeted symbols. They attacked the Seirete itself. They challenged the authority of the captains. They struck at the institutions Yamamoto had spent an entire millennium building. Every success carried both military and psychological significance. For Yamamoto, the invasion represented something deeply personal. Although he remained the captain commander, he was no longer the warrior who had defeated Yhwach 1,000 years earlier. His power remained almost unimaginable, yet age had inevitably changed him. More importantly, the world around him had changed. The organization he commanded no longer resembled the ruthless force he had originally created. The captains standing beside him were honorable leaders, devoted to protecting peace, not hardened conquerors, forged in an era where mercy was considered a dangerous luxury. Yhwach recognized that difference immediately. During their confrontation, he openly criticized Yamamoto for allowing the Gotei 13 to become weaker in spirit, arguing that compassion and attachment had replaced the ruthless determination that once made Soul Society so terrifying. Whether those accusations were entirely fair is difficult to say, but they reveal how Yifach viewed the original captains. He did not remember them as noble defenders of balance. He remembered them as monsters. Ironically, Yamamoto did not completely disagree. Throughout the 1,000-year blood war, there are subtle moments suggesting that he understood exactly what Yifach meant. Yamamoto knew what the original Gotei had been because he had personally assembled every captain. He knew the first generation fought differently. He knew they possessed a level of brutality the modern organization no longer accepted. Rather than denying that history, he accepted it while believing Soul Society had become something better. That belief would define his final years. Perhaps the clearest evidence comes through Shunsui Kyoraku. After Yamamoto's death, Shunsui inherited the position of captain commander and immediately found himself confronting impossible decisions. Unlike many leaders, Shunsui understood that ideals alone could not guarantee survival. Throughout the final arc, he repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to make morally uncomfortable choices whenever Soul Society faced extinction. He released dangerous prisoners. He ordered sacrifices. He accepted responsibilities that few others could bear. In doing so, Shunsui quietly echoed the philosophy of the original Gotei, not because he admired cruelty, because he understood necessity. This balance between compassion and pragmatism becomes one of the central themes of Bleach's final arc. The original captains had perhaps leaned too far toward ruthless efficiency. The modern captains had perhaps become too accustomed to peace. Neither extreme offered a complete answer. Survival required strength, but lasting peace required wisdom. The history of the Gotei 13 became proof of both lessons. The brief glimpses fans receive of the original captains during the 1,000-year blood war only deepen this fascination. Although Tite Kubo reveals almost none of their individual stories, their designs communicate an extraordinary amount about the era they inhabited. Every face appears hardened by conflict. Every expression suggests absolute confidence. Every captain radiates an intimidating presence that immediately distinguishes them from later generations. Even standing silently together, they dominate the page. It is remarkable that characters appearing for only a handful of panels generated so much discussion among fans. Many immediately began speculating about their zanpakuto, their personalities, their accomplishments, and the battles they fought alongside Yamamoto. That reaction speaks to the strength of Kubo's visual storytelling. Without extensive dialogue or detailed backstories, he successfully conveyed that these individuals belonged to an age fundamentally different from everything shown throughout the rest of the series. They looked dangerous. They looked victorious. They looked exactly like the people capable of ending an empire. Unfortunately, history rarely preserves complete records of such individuals. Many of their names remain unknown. Most of their battles remain unseen. Their personal motivations have never been fully explored. Instead, they survive almost entirely through reputation. In some ways, that makes them even more compelling. Legends often become larger than life, precisely because so little is known with certainty. The original Gotei exists almost like an ancient civilization glimpsed through fragments of surviving evidence. We know they defeated Yhwach. We know they nearly destroyed the Quincy as an organized people. We know they were feared even by later generations of Shinigami. Beyond those facts, much remains hidden beneath the passage of time. Perhaps that uncertainty is intentional. History is rarely complete. The further we travel into the past, the more gaps appear between surviving facts. People disappear. Documents are lost. Victories become myths. Defeats become cautionary tales. What remains are fragments that later generations attempt to assemble into coherent narratives, knowing they will never recover every detail. The original Gotei 13 occupies exactly that place within Bleach. They are remembered not because we know everything about them, but because what little we do know is enough to understand their extraordinary impact. They founded the institution that protected Soul Society for the next 1,000 years. They defeated one of the greatest threats the spiritual world had ever faced. And they established a legacy so overwhelming that both allies and enemies continued measuring every future generation against the impossible standard set by those first 13 captains. Yet perhaps their greatest legacy was not the empire they destroyed. Perhaps it was the question they left behind. Can lasting peace ever be built through overwhelming violence? Or does every victory won through bloodshed eventually return to demand an even greater price from those who believed the war had finally ended? Few events in the history of Bleach generate as much debate as the destruction of the original Quincy Empire. Even after the 1,000-year Blood War revealed more about Yhwach and the first generation of the Gotei 13, fans continue asking the same difficult question. Did Soul Society have any other choice? Or did the original captains commit one of the greatest atrocities in the series under the belief that they were protecting the world? The answer is far more complicated than either side would like it to be. Unlike many fictional conflicts that clearly separate heroes from villains, Bleach consistently presents history through competing perspectives. Every major faction believes it is acting for the greater good. Every civilization carries its own version of the past. Every war leaves behind survivors who remember the same events in dramatically different ways. The conflict between the Shinigami and the Quincy represents, perhaps, the clearest example of this approach. From Soul Society's perspective, the danger was genuine. The Quincy destroyed hollows completely, rather than purifying them. According to the Shinigami, that practice threatened the balance separating the human world, Soul Society, and Hueco Mundo. If enough souls disappeared permanently, reality itself could eventually become unstable. Preserving that balance was the central responsibility of the Shinigami, meaning allowing the Quincy to continue unchecked represented a risk they believed they could not accept. Viewed from that perspective, military intervention appears understandable. If an entire civilization possesses the ability to unintentionally destabilize existence itself, waiting until the damage becomes irreversible would be an extraordinary gamble. Yamamoto and the original captains almost certainly believed they were preventing a catastrophe that future generations might never fully understand. The Quincy, however, viewed the situation very differently. From their perspective, they were protecting humanity from hollows more effectively than the Shinigami ever could. They had developed techniques capable of eliminating monsters that terrorized ordinary people, and they followed a king whom they trusted completely. When Soul Society declared those methods unacceptable, many Quincy likely interpreted the decision as political rather than moral. Instead of seeking cooperation or compromise, the Shinigami chose overwhelming military force. Then came the destruction of the Quincy Empire. Entire armies disappeared. Communities collapsed. A civilization that had once challenged Soul Society ceased to exist as a unified power. For the survivors, the conclusion was unavoidable. They had been nearly exterminated. This difference in perspective becomes even more interesting when we consider what Bleach never confirms. Canon establishes that Quincy techniques threaten the balance of souls, but it never fully explores whether meaningful alternatives were seriously pursued before total war became inevitable. Could stricter regulations have prevented disaster? Could the Quincy have modified their techniques? Could negotiations have succeeded if both civilizations had trusted one another more? The story deliberately refuses to answer those questions. That silence is important. It forces readers to confront the uncomfortable reality that history rarely provides perfect information. Leaders make decisions based upon the knowledge available at the time, often without knowing whether different choices might have produced better outcomes. Yamamoto believed decisive action would preserve the worlds. Ichigo believed resistance was necessary for the survival of his people. Both leaders acted with absolute conviction. Both also left behind unimaginable suffering. The original Gotei 13 occupies an especially uncomfortable position within this debate because their methods make it difficult to separate necessity from excess. Had they merely defeated Ichigo's army, history might remember them very differently. Instead, they continued dismantling the Quincy Empire until organized resistance effectively ceased to exist. Whether that represented unavoidable military strategy or unnecessary brutality depends largely upon which perspective a person adopts. Even within Soul Society, opinions appear to have evolved over time. The Gotei 13 that Ichigo encounters throughout most of the series behaves very differently from the organization founded by Yamamoto. Modern captains place far greater emphasis upon restraint, proportional force, and protecting innocent lives whenever possible. That evolution suggests the institution itself gradually recognized the limitations of the philosophy that had guided its earliest victories. Strength remained essential. Unrestrained violence did not. This gradual transformation also explains why the revelation of the original captains shocked so many fans. They looked nothing like the leaders audiences had come to admire. Their expressions, posture, and overall appearance communicated an organization forged almost entirely through conflict. Rather than undermining the Gotei's legacy, those revelations complicated it, reminding us that institutions capable of preserving peace are often born during extraordinarily violent periods. History is filled with similar examples. Civilizations frequently celebrate the stability created by their founders, while quietly avoiding discussions about the methods used to establish that stability in the first place. As centuries pass, victories become traditions. Traditions become institutions, and uncomfortable details slowly fade into the background. Bleach embraces that reality instead of avoiding it. The series repeatedly asks whether peace achieved through overwhelming violence can ever remain permanent. The first Quincy War appears to offer one answer. Soul Society won decisively and enjoyed nearly 1,000 years without another major external invasion. From a strategic perspective, the campaign achieved exactly what Yamamoto intended. Yet the hatred survived. The memories survived. Ichigo survived. Eventually, the consequences returned with even greater force than before. That does not necessarily mean the original Gotei made the wrong decision. It simply means that even overwhelming victory cannot erase history. Every choice carries consequences. Every war creates future conflicts. Every generation inherits the decisions of those who came before. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson left behind by the first Quincy genocide. It was neither a simple story of heroes defeating villains, nor villains destroying innocent victims. It was the collision of two civilizations convinced that survival required absolute victory, leaving behind a legacy that neither side could ever truly escape, no matter how many centuries passed between the first battle and the last. By the end of the 1,000-year blood war, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The original Gotei 13 had shaped every major event in modern Soul Society, even though almost none of its members were still alive to witness the consequences of their actions. Their victories created the peace that allowed the Seirete to flourish. Their methods influenced every generation of captains that followed. Their war against the Quincy directly led to the conflict that nearly destroyed Soul Society 1,000 years later. Few groups in Bleach history have left a legacy so immense while remaining so mysterious. That mystery is part of what makes them so fascinating. Unlike characters whose entire lives are explored across dozens of chapters, the founding captains appear only briefly. They receive almost no dialogue, almost no backstory, and almost no explanation of their individual achievements. Yet despite that lack of information, they immediately command attention. Every design, every expression, and every small glimpse suggests people who belonged to an era fundamentally different from the one readers had grown accustomed to. They do not look like guardians. They look like conquerors. That impression was almost certainly intentional. Tite Kubo wanted readers to understand that the Soul Society protecting Ichigo Kurosaki was not the same Soul Society that had once defeated Ichigo. The institution had survived for 1,000 years, but survival had changed it. Traditions had replaced improvisation. Laws had replaced personal authority. Discipline had replaced the brutal individualism that defined the first generation. The captains serving beneath Yamamoto during the main story inherited an organization already shaped by centuries of peace, while the original captains had been forced to create that peace through war. Neither generation can be fully understood without the other. Modern captains often appear morally superior because they value restraint, cooperation, and responsibility. Those qualities are admirable, but they were made possible by the sacrifices and victories of earlier generations. At the same time, the original Gotei achieved extraordinary military success precisely because they embraced methods that later captains would consider unacceptable. One generation built the foundation. The other transformed it into something worth preserving. Yamamoto stands at the center of both worlds. No other character embodies Bleach's long history more completely than the Captain Commander. He witnessed the chaotic age before the Gotei existed, personally assembled the first generation of captains, defeated Yvak during the original war, and then spent the next 1,000 years reshaping his own organization into a far more honorable institution. Very few fictional leaders experience such dramatic evolution while remaining fundamentally committed to the same purpose: protect Soul Society. Everything else changed. That commitment explains why Yamamoto remains such a compelling character even after his death. He was capable of terrifying violence, yet he also spent centuries trying to ensure that future generations would never need to become the kind of warriors he once commanded. In many ways, his greatest achievement was not defeating Yvak. It was creating a world where captains like Ukitake, Shunsui, and Hitsugaya could exist. Leaders whose first instinct was protection rather than destruction. Leaders who viewed strength as a responsibility instead of a weapon. Of course, history rarely moves in a straight line. When Yhwach returned, the modern Gotei discovered that ideals alone could not stop an enemy determined to erase everything they had built. Throughout the 1,000-year blood war, several captains found themselves making increasingly difficult decisions, accepting sacrifices they would once have considered unthinkable. In those moments, echoes of the original Gotei quietly resurfaced. Not because the modern captains wanted to imitate their predecessors, but because survival, once again, demanded choices that peace had allowed them to forget. Shunsui understood this better than anyone. After inheriting Yamamoto's position, he immediately demonstrated a willingness to carry burdens that few others could accept. He released dangerous allies from imprisonment. He manipulated events behind the scenes. He accepted moral ambiguity whenever he believed it necessary to protect Soul Society. Although Shunsui remained far more compassionate than the founders of the Gotei, he also recognized an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, leadership requires decisions that history will never celebrate. Perhaps that realization connects him more closely to Yamamoto than any other captain. The original Gotei 13 ultimately serves as a reminder that institutions are never born fully formed. Every civilization possesses a beginning, and those beginnings are often far harsher than the peaceful societies that emerge generations later. The Seirete admired by modern Shinigami did not appear overnight. It was built through conflict, sacrifice, compromise, and countless decisions whose morality remains open to debate even after 1,000 years. That complexity is exactly why the original captains continue capturing the imagination of Bleach fans. They represent an age where legends walked the battlefield, where survival mattered more than reputation, and where 13 extraordinary warriors permanently altered the course of history. Their names may remain largely unknown, but their influence reaches every corner of the series. Every captain who wears the white Hari inherits the institution they created. Every Shinigami who protects the balance of souls serves within the organization they forged. Every victory achieved by the modern Gotei rests upon foundations laid during an age of relentless warfare. The original captains have almost vanished from history. Their legacy never did. Even after 1,000 years, the Soul Society they built continues to stand as both a monument to their greatest triumph and a reminder of the terrible price that triumph demanded, proving that history's most influential figures are often remembered not because every detail of their lives survives, but because the world they created continues shaping the lives of everyone who comes after them. One of the most interesting questions raised by the 1,000-year blood war is why Soul Society never attempted to recreate the original Gotei 13. If the first generation of captains was powerful enough to defeat Iwatch at the height of his empire, why did Yamamoto spend the next 1,000 years replacing those legendary warriors with captains who were, by his own admission and by Iwatch's observations, far less ruthless? At first glance, the decision appears almost contradictory. If the original Gotei represented the strongest military force in Soul Society's history, preserving that model would seem like the logical choice. Yet Yamamoto deliberately chose a different path. The answer lies in understanding what the original Gotei actually was. It was never intended to become the permanent identity of Soul Society. It was a weapon built for one specific moment in history. When Yamamoto gathered the first 13 captains, he was responding to an era defined by chaos. The Seirei had not yet matured into the organized civilization seen during Ichigo Kurosaki's lifetime. The Quincy Empire continued expanding beneath Iwatch's leadership. Internal order remained fragile. Powerful spiritual threats existed both inside and outside Soul Society, and no institution possessed enough authority to maintain lasting stability. Under those circumstances, Yamamoto concluded that only extraordinary individuals could prevent complete collapse. He was almost certainly correct. A peaceful government cannot emerge unless someone first survives long enough to build it. The original captains accomplished exactly that. They defeated Iwatch. They established Soul Society as the dominant spiritual power. They eliminated the greatest external threat of their age. They created the conditions necessary for future generations to inherit something more than endless warfare. Once those objectives had been achieved, however, the qualities that made the first Gotei so effective gradually became less desirable. An organization filled with legendary killers functions remarkably well during wartime. It functions far less effectively during centuries of peace. Running hospitals, training academies, research divisions, judicial systems, and administrative institutions requires entirely different skills than conquering battlefields. As Soul Society stabilized, Yamamoto began promoting leaders capable not only of winning fights, but also of governing responsibly. Compassion became an advantage rather than a weakness. Patience became valuable. Diplomacy became possible. Strength remained essential, but it no longer served as the only qualification for leadership. This transformation can be observed throughout the Gotei's structure. The fourth division evolved into an organization devoted primarily to healing rather than combat. The 12th division increasingly focused upon scientific research under figures such as Kisuke Urahara and later Mayuri Kurotsuchi. Captains became mentors responsible for training younger Shinigami, rather than merely commanding soldiers in battle. The institution slowly shifted from functioning as a conquering army to serving as the foundation of an entire civilization. That evolution was one of Yamamoto's greatest achievements. Many military organizations throughout history struggle to adapt after major wars. The qualities necessary to win conflicts often differ dramatically from those required to preserve peace. Leaders who remain permanently committed to wartime thinking frequently create new conflicts simply because they cannot imagine another way of governing. Yamamoto avoided that mistake. He recognized that the world had changed. More importantly, he allowed the Gotei to change with it. This does not mean he forgot what the original captains had accomplished. On the contrary, Yamamoto appears to have carried those memories throughout his entire life. Every rule he established, every tradition he enforced, and every expectation he placed upon future captains reflected lessons learned during the brutal conflicts of his youth. He never rejected the past. He simply refused to let the future remain trapped inside it. Ironically, that decision may also explain why Ichigo believed the modern Gotei had grown weaker. When the Quincy king compared the captains standing before him to the warriors he had fought 1,000 years earlier, he saw enormous differences. The modern captains protected civilians. They hesitated before making sacrifices. They valued cooperation. Some specialized in medicine, intelligence gathering, or scientific research rather than pure combat. Compared to the terrifying figures who once devastated the Quincy Empire, they undoubtedly appeared less intimidating. From Ichigo's perspective, that meant they had declined. From Yamamoto's perspective, it meant they had succeeded. The purpose of the original Gotei had never been to create an eternal culture of violence. Its purpose had been to ensure that future generations would no longer need to live that way. Perhaps the greatest symbol of this philosophy is Unohana herself. No other captain experienced a transformation as dramatic as hers. The woman once feared as the most dangerous criminal in Soul Society abandoned that identity to become its greatest healer. She did not lose her strength. She chose to use it differently. Her journey reflects the larger story of the Gotei 13, an organization that slowly redirected overwhelming power away from conquest and toward preservation. Even so, history has an unfortunate tendency to repeat itself. When the 1,000-year blood war erupted, Soul Society suddenly found itself facing conditions remarkably similar to those that had existed a millennium earlier. Once again, extinction became a genuine possibility. Once again, impossible decisions confronted the captains. Once again, victory required sacrifices that would have seemed unacceptable during peaceful times. The difference was that the modern Gotei refused to become identical to its predecessors. It adapted without abandoning its humanity. That distinction ultimately became one of the greatest differences between Yamamoto's generation and the captains who followed. The original Gotei won because they were feared above all else. The modern Gotei survived because, despite unimaginable losses, it continued fighting for the people it existed to protect, rather than allowing fear to consume the values that had been built across the previous 1,000 years. In the end, perhaps that was Yamamoto's true legacy. He did not spend a millennium trying to preserve the original Gotei 13. He spent a millennium making sure it would never be necessary to create another one like it. That decision transformed the institution from a gathering of history's deadliest warriors into the guardians of soul society, proving that the greatest victory achieved by the original captains was not simply defeating the Quincy Empire, but creating a world where future generations could choose compassion, without forgetting the terrible cost that had made such a choice possible. The story of the original Gotei 13 is not really about 13 captains. It is about the price of peace. When most people think about soul society, they picture white captains Haori flowing through the streets of the Seirei, disciplined divisions carrying out their duties, and Shinigami protecting the balance between the worlds with quiet professionalism. It feels like an ancient civilization that has always existed in its present form, guided by tradition and sustained by a clear sense of justice. Yet the deeper Bleach explores its own history, the more obvious it becomes that this peaceful image rests upon foundations built during one of the bloodiest eras the spiritual world had ever witnessed. The soul society that Ichigo Kurosaki inherited was not created peacefully. It survived because an earlier generation fought with extraordinary brutality. That uncomfortable truth sits at the heart of the original Gotei 13's legacy. For centuries, the captains who served beneath Yamamoto were celebrated as protectors, symbols of stability, and guardians of the balance of souls. Those descriptions are accurate, but they tell only part of the story. Long before the Gotei became an institution associated with honor and responsibility, it was a military force assembled for a single purpose. Its members were expected to eliminate threats so completely that future generations would never have to fight the same wars again. That objective shaped everything they became. The original captains were not chosen because they represented the highest ideals of soul society. They were chosen because they could survive an age where ideals alone meant very little. The 1,000-year blood war fundamentally changed the way many fans viewed Yamamoto. Before that arc, he often appeared as an elderly commander whose strict devotion to rules occasionally bordered on stubbornness. After learning about the first Gotei, however, that image became far more complicated. We suddenly understood that this quiet old man had once led the most terrifying military force in Soul Society's history. He had personally defeated Iwatch. He had commanded captains feared even by later generations of Shinigami. Most remarkably of all, he had then spent the next 1,000 years transforming that organization into something almost unrecognizable. Very few leaders accomplish such a transformation. Winning a war is difficult. Changing the culture of the army that won it may be even harder. Yamamoto managed both. That achievement does not erase the suffering caused during the First Quincy War, nor should it. One of Bleach's greatest strengths as a story is its refusal to present history as morally simple. The destruction of the Quincy Empire preserved the balance of the worlds according to Soul Society's understanding of reality. Yet it also devastated an entire civilization whose survivors carried those memories for 1,000 years. The first Gotei believed they were protecting existence itself. The Quincy believed they were fighting for the survival of their people. History allowed both beliefs to exist simultaneously. Perhaps that is why the 1,000-year blood war feels so different from many other conflicts in anime. There is no single moment where the audience is invited to declare one side completely righteous and the other entirely evil. Instead, every revelation forces us to reconsider assumptions made earlier in the story. The Shinigami are not flawless guardians. The Quincy are not mindless invaders. Both civilizations possess legitimate fears, genuine accomplishments, and terrible mistakes that continue influencing later generations. The original Gotei stands directly at the center of that complexity. Although we know remarkably little about most of the founding captains, their influence can be found everywhere. Every division traces its origins back to them. Every captain who wears the white haori inherits the institution they created. Every major conflict involving Soul Society exists, at least in part, because of decisions made during their era. Even characters who never met those legendary warriors continue living inside the world they built. That is an extraordinary legacy. Perhaps even more remarkable is how little recognition they receive within the story itself. Modern Shinigami rarely discuss them. Their individual names remain largely forgotten. Their achievements survive more as distant legends than detailed historical records. It almost feels intentional, as though Soul Society quietly allowed many aspects of that violent age to disappear beneath centuries of tradition. Nations often prefer remembering the peace their founders created, rather than the methods used to create it. The Seirete appears no different. Yet history cannot be erased so easily. When Yuwatch returned after 1,000 years, the past returned with him. The modern Gotei was forced to confront not only a powerful enemy, but also the consequences of choices made by people they had never met. The war became a reminder that victories achieved through overwhelming force may solve immediate problems while leaving deeper wounds untouched. Those wounds can remain dormant for generations before reopening with even greater intensity. That lesson extends far beyond Bleach. History, whether fictional or real, rarely ends cleanly. Every generation inherits both the triumphs and the failures of those who came before. Civilizations are shaped as much by forgotten decisions as by famous victories. Leaders often spend decades solving problems without realizing they are simultaneously creating new ones for their descendants. The original Gotei 13 illustrates that reality better than almost any other group in anime. They saved Soul Society. They nearly destroyed the Quincy. They secured 1,000 years of relative peace. They also created the conditions that eventually produced another catastrophic war. all of those statements are true. None of them cancel the others. Perhaps that is why the original Gotei continues capturing the imagination of Bleach fans despite appearing so briefly. They represent an era where legends were forged through conflict rather than reputation, where survival demanded extraordinary sacrifices, and where the line separating heroism from brutality became almost impossible to define. They remind us that history's greatest figures are often neither saints nor monsters, but complicated individuals making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. In the end, the original Gotei 13 was never remembered simply because it was the strongest generation of captains. It was remembered because it changed the course of history forever. Its members built the soul society that countless generations would defend, transformed the balance of power within the spiritual world, and proved that peace is rarely born from idealism alone. Sometimes it emerges only after extraordinary suffering, carried into the future by people who hope their descendants will never again be forced to make the same terrible choices. Whether those choices were ultimately justified remains one of Bleach's greatest unanswered questions. And perhaps that uncertainty is exactly what makes the story of the original Gotei 13 one of the richest and most thought-provoking pieces of lore in the entire series.